Welcome. Today we have Grace Jia, and she is currently associate professor at Kansas State University. Today we'll have her talking with us about different experience with qualitative research in our educational leadership field and her suggestions and advice. So Grace, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm very glad to have you here because many of our educational leadership doctoral students do qualitative study. And a large percentage of the published articles are also qualitative studies in our field. So it's great to have some expert talking with us about how to conduct a good quality qualitative research in our field. So my first question to you, Grace, is that can you tell us about your background in leadership and your experience with qualitative research?
Sure. Well, you are really giving me high words about that. I don't see myself as expert in qualitative inquiry. We know there's a field about qualitative methodology because I graduated from University of Georgia, and they actually have a doctoral degree in that. Of course, that was time after I graduated from that university, that department. I don't want to reveal my age, but I had years enough to kind of share some of my perspectives. So with everyone who is willing to give their time and space to listen. I graduated from University of Georgia in the Department of Educational Administration, Leadership and Policy. Oh, my faculty are going to blame me. I cannot even remember the name now. But anyway, I graduated there in 2014, December. My dissertation was a qualitative study. I was very fortunate because the department I was in, they actually house 3 different programs. One is my discipline, which is PK-12 Education Leadership, Administration and Policy. And then the other program is Qualitative Research or Inquiry. And then there's another program is in the Human Resources or Adult Ed. So that's kind of like at the time, that was the 3 programs housed within the same department. So I had opportunity to actually learn from some of most well-known scholars and methodologists in qualitative research, that field of inquiry. I was kind of not intentionally was seeking for qualitative inquiry. My master and my undergrad background very much is on the quantitative side because I had a educational psychology. So I wasn't really looking for qualitative, even though the 3 programs were housing in the same department, I did not really start it there. But it was actually more later when I started finding I was very drawn into certain topics as I came into a time when I was deciding what some of the topics I was particularly interested and consider as my dissertation topic. I was struggling because my dissertation was focused on Asian Americans in PK-12 leadership. And then I realized there were not many. So if you think about kind of simplest way to say, if you're going to do a quantitative study, then you need numbers. You have enough students, you have enough teachers, probably enough to carry you to choose certain quantitative approach, you do that. But since my focus was on who are actually serving administrative roles, and I really just ran into that realization, no, I could not do that. But then in the meantime, I discovered myself, for lack of a better term, I did not want to give up because sometimes a very important message, very important topics cannot be justified by they are not big enough in the number to say, okay, they're not important. So I kind of made myself particularly understand is there's something very important, cannot we rely on number. That's when I started to take more serious eyes on the qualitative field. Can I learn something? Can I find different tools to really focus on these very important topics? So that's how I start seeing these 2 paths coming together. My home discipline, education leadership, qualitative research as a way to allow me to investigating things really matter to personally, but also matters to scholarship. That's a little background about myself on education leadership. I particularly interested in education leadership practice, but also the so-called career trajectory, particularly related to how that practice or the trajectory being diversified or not diversified, and who are considered to be the right material for leaders, who actually see themselves, and then how they see themselves practice leadership for diversity populations, for equity. And so that kind of lands the general way if you talk about my scholarship. If you narrow down my research interest to more narrow ones, particularly looking through Asian Americans, because it's a very dear thing to myself personally, but also if you think about how United States as a society racialized this particular community, because it's very diverse, but somehow society tend to have a very homogeneous way to look at this community and racialize them. If you have a little bit of knowledge about that, consider somewhere not in there, not here, not there, somewhere in between. And we're being weaponized as a way to really keep that status quo through this very unique racialization to understand how leadership as a field and also leadership as a practice, a profession, have those kind of issues in terms of being very dominant way who is considered to be leaders and what a kind of dominant way to lead when actually different practice and knowledge coming from more diverse perspective can really help the schools to bring equity and quality education to all our children.
Great. So you shared why you chose qualitative research methods, which makes sense. My next question is about, in your view, what are the most frequent mistakes researchers make when conducting qualitative research in leadership? With my experience with some of the student or qualitative articles that I read, I don't see a compelling justification like what you provided. Like students choose qualitative study for convenience. They don't like quantitative methods, or they're not comfortable with the quantitative method, so they chose a qualitative method. So what are the common mistakes you see in our students conducting qualitative research?
So this topic, I think it's a very big topic. The first one, I will talk these two things, then I will go back to more little kind of philosophical or theoretical explanation. So the first one I see is our students or sometimes even people doing research in our field is they misunderstand there's different levels or scopes of so-called research process. When somebody say, oh, I'm going to do an interview, what they often, for example, confused or conflated is methods, a specific tool, but methodology is your overall design. When you think about a design, that design from some kind of alignment from the philosophical level to the tools, right? If you kind of conflating them, then you don't really need that philosophical or even that worldview, which is the fundamental difference when somebody finding they're more inclined based on their research purpose and also based on where they're coming from, that philosophical space. They tend to end up in that quantitative approaches versus somebody really finding the qualitative approaches are the ways they finding more resonance based on where they stand philosophical, but also the specific research question or the phenomenon they are looking into. So that's one thing. So they tend to misunderstand or conflate the different levels in terms of the whole research process. So second one is students tend to misunderstand or confused so-called popular text, or popular knowledge versus so-called rich, dense text or knowledge. It's human nature. We tend to grab into things. It's easy, accessible. They are very easy to read, right? Because, when somebody first enter the space, of course, those are things tend to catch our eye first because they're so easy to read. And then we don't have to read several times to get really what the gist of what the text about. That's why a lot of those introductory texts tend to grab our attention first. That's okay. But what the problem is, just because they're popular, because we find some resonance, that does not justify you can stay there throughout your research process. One of the way I kind of explain and help my students to understand that is, just like you go to see a doctor, you will go to the general doctor, but once you kind of know the specific, let's say, symptom or the illness or something, you go specialist because they are specialized. So what that means is, same thing when you do a methodology, you read the introductory text to get a little bit, little surfacing, just kind of get a little taste of that. But once you get that little taste, then you need to go further to really looking into those so-called expert on different methodology, if that helps you to really narrow down what exactly the one or two could be the tools for you, the methodology. But what I find is students tend to stay with that introductory text because that's easy to read and easy to grab on. And then they just finding that to be the way they're going to carry out the whole that. And the way I help my students understand is kind of explaining that is what you are communicating to your future reader is, I only have my introductory level of knowledge. So trust me, I will carry out a good study because I had the introductory text. That is kind of help my students understand, oh no, I can enter by the expectations. I will go further and to be more specialized. The parallel to that is, I said, that doesn't mean I do not encourage you. I don't think any of the faculty or scholars or researchers is when they say that, it's not mean you cannot critique or you have to follow to the T's to the expert. What that really means is, in order for you to finding something is not serve you, for you to critique constructively, you have to have certain knowledge built up to understand the expert, where they coming from. Then you can do the critique. It's not saying just because I ask you to read expert, you take it as quote unquote the Bible, the God. Okay, that's not, none of those mean that. But that's a very important step for you to actually do the critique to say, oh no, I find this is the shortcoming. Oh, that kind of coming after. The popular text is because they're so easy to read. They don't really go depth. They do not allow you to really see the nuances across different so-called methodology under this huge family or tenets, so-called qualitative methodology or qualitative inquiry. Because that, I was going to pull a little bit distance from the immediate, what I see so-called the immediate problem is coming from is oftentimes across our educational leadership programs, students don't get the luxury to really take enough courses to get there. This is not just one program, two programs. They maybe only take 2 courses or maybe 3. And then if you think about, okay, how do I know which would be? First, I probably need to decide, am I doing quantitative or qualitative? I only have 1 left. So that really is not giving enough room for students to actually to, whether they are willingly or we kind of gently, nudgely encourage them to do that, there's not much room for them to do that kind of further exploration unless they actually to be kind of like guided by the advisor and do actual reading of that, rather than kind of the coursework or the scaffolding them to do that. They did not enter the space understanding what makes some the so-called qualitative, not versus. I do not consider these 2 families to be oppositional. There are different tools to serve different purpose. No tools are designed perfect for everything. That's absolutely what I believe in. So if there are tools, then guess what? They're going to really work very well with certain things. And the tools designed with certain perspective functionality already there. So the tools definitely have that. And of course, another aspect of using tools is how good are you as a user? The user part is coming from, I don't want to kind of using big words, but it's important for me to say those kind of words, which are coming from the ontology and epistemology. So ontology really is coming back, really just all the way to the bottom is, what do you see the world? If I believe there's those so-called absolute truths out there, we typically call that is a big T, okay? Absolute truth. What that means is the truth is always out there. Doesn't matter how I perceive it, the absolute truth is literally not influenced by anything. If that's what I believe in, then everything I do in terms of research, whatever, because that's part of who I am, right? I'm talking about very philosophical. Then everything I do as a researcher, whatever, the field or the community of researchers is try to minimize, remove all these variations because we are trying to get to the absolute truth. So that is why so-called the objectivity become very important. One way to accomplish that is through very standardized systematic. So that's why you tend to find in quantitative dissertation have those very standard language, right? So we did not say fail to reject. You cannot say it did not support. You say fail to reject. It's because we try to remove all these moving pieces because we want to get the absolute truth. If somebody is not in that kind of ontology, which is kind of the qualitative, is what we believe is the so-called the lower T, which means is every truth is partial. When that means is the truth is very contextualized. The example I tend to help students on then that is in my field or even teacher ed field, we all know professional development happen all the time. If you and me, we both go to exactly the same professional development, I don't even need to ask that question. I already knew. You and me will not get the same thing. Doesn't matter, we'll stay in the same room, listen to the same instruction. What that really means, the truth is always contextualized, always partial. In order for us to get the truth, it's always collective. by doing qualitative research, understanding that contextualized knowledge making, meaning making, collectively, we will get close to what that holistic picture look like. Okay? So if that's the case, then guess what? Instead of trying pretending so-called those noise is not there, so-called this just subjectivity are not there, we actually recognize them and really analyze how those so-called subjectivity play out into our research process, shaping the way how we understand the data, shaping the way how we're actually collecting the data. That is kind of the way fundamentally why the two canon of way approach so-called truth become very important, depends on where you stand philosophically, but also depends on how the specific phenomenon or issue you are looking at.
It reminds me of the interpretation of the finding, right? If you come from different philosophical beliefs of what the truth is, then you should be very cautious when you interpret your findings in the section of discussion. I agree with what you said, but I see the problem when researchers interpret their findings, they interpret qualitative findings as absolute truth.
Well, I don't know what kind of articles or qualitative study you have read, but one of the kind of the way I help my students understand is a quick assessment. What they're reading is pretty decent qualitative study is if they find when they are reading this particular study, the findings are presented as very much of the clear-cut way. And then I said, well, you probably should be more cautious because, like I said, the qualitative is very much anchoring on this idea of sense-making is very complex, very partial and situated. So guess what? The finding the author, the researcher present to you should have more of the complexity there. Rather than give you this overgeneralized way about this phenomenon, they tend to situate it in finding in a very contextualized way, but also presenting potential alternative explanation for what's going on, of course, supported by the literature, because like I said, it's accumulation. And when the current findings are in kind of difference or even contrasting the previous literature, then also providing potential explanation have certain grounding in the literature as well. That's what I help my students understand is the author is painting a very complex way about the phenomenon rather than this very clear-cut way of explaining what's going on. That's a quick way to access that. Another way is I start seeing more of the qualitative journal requiring the researcher when they are doing qualitative study, they actually be very clear who they are as researchers in relation to this particular topic. So that also is give the readers another important lens into that subjectivity, which is shaping the meaning-making process from the researcher. Because we all know when we're in a conversation, for example, in you and me, we both interview the same participant asking exactly the same question. We're not going to be drawn to exactly the same content in the data, okay, quote unquote data. So that's why the subjectivity and positionality particularly relate to the research topic. I'm not saying you have to include everything about who you are. Most important thing is who you are in relation to this research topic, right? Because you are research's topic. So who you are in relation to that topic is going to shape your overall design. And being, initial design you carry out, because in quality research, the researcher literally is the tool, right? You do the interview, you decide what kind of documents you're going to collect, and you read the documents. That's interpretation. You cannot read separating those things. Then the flip of that is, so are you telling me quantitative people don't interpret? Oh, they do. A simple example would be, say, how you want to decide which of the different, for example, exploratory factor analysis. There's different way you can rotate that things. All these are decision-making. You can, sometimes two of the ways are equally applicable, but you as a researcher have to kind of decide which of the dimensionality you're going to do. That's a research judgment right there. I remember that when I was in Ed Psych, what we talk about is even so-called significance level. It's a community agreement. Nobody ever said that can be validated just because 0.05. Because if you go to genetics, they're like, oh, that's way too hot. It should be 0.00 something. 0.05 is not acceptable. It's not saying just because qualitative people interpret, quantitative people don't. No, that's not what I'm trying to say here. What I'm saying here is because that ontology and epistemology, because ontology is talking what it is the reality of existence, and come with that is epistemology, is talking about how we know what we know. So that's the knowledge part. They serve slightly different focus based on your philosophical standing, but also on the issue you at hand. I talk about the very beginning is sometimes the number can really grapple on those kind of things.
And the number can be very detailed.
Yeah.
It just that illusion of objectivity, but it's so easy to manipulate those.
Yeah. I mean, each field will have some mechanism to help to minimize those inappropriate manipulation or inappropriate subjectivity.
Right.
But doesn't mean that there's no subjectivity just because somebody doing quantitative, that everything that is objective. That's not where I'm saying here. I think the good thing for scholars from so-called the both canons actually recognize that, because I remember we have a conversation with psychologists, because the field of psychology very much known for heavily on quant. And when you have scholars recognize that, you can actually have very good constructive conversation about it.
Good. I want to ask a follow-up question. You talk about the popular text versus rich and dense text. What are some of the examples? If students or researchers want to become an expert, want to learn more or dig deeper when it comes to methods, what are the rich dense texts they should be looking at?
Very good question. There are popular texts out there. Actually, there's a lot of methodology texts out there. What I tend to advise my students is there's two sources. I want to start there before you kind of go too further. There's so-called classic publications or pieces, which means it can be books, it can be, just an article, but they weathered very well, which means after decades since they were first published, they still have a lot of relevancy. They still stay in a place in a very important for that particular field or for that particular research direction. One of the books I use in my intro to qualitative, it's not easy read text. Every time I teach students in our course, I will make sure they understand it's not easy read. It's not those popular read. It's going to take some time to really dive. Sometimes they maybe took even like 30 minutes just reading one page. That's totally fine. But what I'm trying to say is because something are so dense, so important, that's why it takes you a longer time to digest. For example, the refined sugar, your body take it and use it very quickly. But protein, it takes longer to digest, but they're much better than refined sugar. I know students get a little frustrated because that's the first class they getting into the quality. Just because you find yourself, because students like, I feel like I'm so stupid because I'm a very accomplished professional. It took me like 30, 40 minutes just reading one page. I'm like, but that's a different thing. It's not something you have been reading. Exactly. But I think I understand where their frustration coming from. So I try to use kind of those examples to illustrate, that's very common. Guess what? After many years teaching using that textbook, I still have to revisit those pages. That tells you important work does take time to kind of digest, to really get the gist. It's important for them to understand those kind of philosophical foundations. They're important in the sense not expecting you to just grab everything by taking one course. Because some of the click, some of the aha moment will come later. You're starting to have elements linked together throughout your coursework. So be patient, be a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty. With those blanks, okay? So that's another skill students need to kind of develop throughout their journey when doing research is be a little bit comfortable about uncertainty, knowing there's a higher chance they will get that uncertainty to be, and then those aha moments will come. So sit with those uncertainty. That's another skill they learn as a researcher too. I think I lost my thought of track.
That's okay.
Popular text. Our students are in education leadership, and there are a lot of them they're professionals. Unless they want to stay in academics, become faculty researchers, then they had a slightly different starting point, and then the way they pursue things slightly differently. What I'm helping most of my students is say, okay, I understand it's important for you to see how dissertation is done. or you've been reading some of those like very quick, easy digest materials because that your life are being busy. That's just how you function professionally. But I want you to kind of slow down. Those are top journals in our field, but they're not journals on methodology. So when you're reading those journals, you're going to get a very small or like a minimum portion of the methodology. Think about it is go read some of the methodology journals. So, and same idea, you're going to, in the beginning, finding very kind of uneasy because they're not in your discipline. They're not the typical language you're going to see day in and day out. But the more you read across, then you started seeing the linkage or you started seeing the alignment. And it's the same idea when you're reading literature, you have to kind of accumulate a certain quantity to actually see that qualitative change. And the student kind of take my class, say, no, I tend to use this. And then I said, well, you are in a huge mountain. Okay. Of course, you're going to be overwhelmed. You don't know which path is which. You don't even see the path because you're so low in the footing. So as you climbing, now you start seeing the terrain of the mountain. You start seeing different paths leading different hills inside the big mountain. And that's when you start seeing the clarity and seeing the interconnection between those paths or hills. So I do kind of share those journals with my students. But also another thing is, don't forget the way you're reading journals, the way you're reading resources is going to be different, right? Because oftentimes when you're reading articles, you don't look at their references because references is a very academic way. The way you're actually finding more of the depths or more of the rich, dense text is to read the reference list. When they give that. So the reading style is different. It's not something we typically do outside so-called academic way. Recognize you are reading for multiple purposes. You're reading something related to the topic. You're reading something about potential sources you can read further. And you're also reading some of so-called, particularly related to the section about implication. Something is have not been done enough relate to your topic or something. The reference list would be another place to really kind of finding, okay, should I read further into particularly relate to this particular methodology? The third one, I don't really introduce them early, is dissertation because dissertation have a lot of variations. I tend to introduce that later, try to help them to understand the structure of the dissertation, not necessarily the quality of dissertation can differ drastically. And I tend to hold on that a little bit, but I do give them the outline about what each of the chapter, the expectation, the purpose, or the interconnecting between the chapters. But I don't typically recommend reading dissertation because sometimes a really bad model of dissertation can really derail the students in terms of what they believe.
I tend to recommend my students to read high quality journal articles instead of dissertation. If you can do a journal article very well, then you should have no problem with writing a dissertation. Another follow-up question. Do you have a list of the journals on the qualitative research methods that you can share with
Absolutely. I can compile that.
And...
It's ready. In my course at Canvas, I provide a list for them. So yeah, I can definitely share that with you. Yeah.
Thank you. Just my experience, I read a journal, which is called a SAGE journal, published by SAGE, which is called Organizational Research Method. That journal, I think it has an impact factor of 12. They talk about how to conduct a qualitative research with rigor. They also talk about the quantitative research, the problem with quantitative research methods in the field of general organizational research, which I find very helpful. So I recommend that journal. As you said, it's very dense. It's rich and dense. Sometimes I have to reread the article multiple times just to figure out how to do it, what are the points they're talking about. And they have a lot of very practical recommendations for researchers. If you want to take this approach and how do you do it? As you said, the reference section is also very helpful. So are there common mistakes that you see in qualitative research?
I think it's kind of an extension from my second about so-called popular text or knowledge versus rich is sometimes students will take so-called popular discourse. For example, somebody will say, okay, I'm going to do a phenomenology because phenomenology means I just go to the nature of phenomenology. I don't really have a pre-idea about what the literature about. They should not have any review. But what they did not really understand is phenomenology is probably one of the most difficult way to do it. The reason is phenomenology itself is a philosophy too. But then if phenomenology is also a methodology, have two very kind of different approaches. One is so-called interpretive phenomenology. What they recognize is even though I try to get the essence of the phenomenon, there's no way for me to not make interpretations. And the other one is literally so-called the origin of phenomenology. The idea is I'm trying to withhold everything I have so I can get to the essence of the phenomena. That has to be found to be really difficult. The phenomenology as a philosophy also changed since it started with Europe and went to North America. The genealogy and even the main tenets within that changed. So that's why I actually saying phenomenology is probably one of the most difficult methodology when somebody just, if they take first idea and then they're like, oh, I understand what that is. And same could be about interpretivism. One of the most thing you will see people saying, okay, I'm interpretive or symbolic interactionism. Student was thinking it's like, oh, since I am, interpreters really honor my participant's voice. So I'm just going to use whatever their words. That's not what I mean. What that really means is they recognize rather than thinking about the so-called the participant sense making this very contextualizing the broad social, cultural, political context, interpretism really is saying, okay, I'm anchoring on focusing on how individuals interpret our world around them. But that does not mean those kind of individual interpretation, nothing to do with the big structure. For interpreting is focused on that individual level of interpretation. The constructivism is kind of a little flip side of that. They recognize there's individual agency in terms of how they interpret the world, but they're more interested to find out how the broad structure is shaping that individual interpretism. So it's kind of like the two sides of one coin. If you think about what I said in the beginning, is qualitative inquiry is try to piece every collectively meaning making. You can see how these two actually can make our knowledge about so-called meaning making to be more holistic. And another way I help my students to understand there's nuances across different approaches or methodology within the qualitative research is oftentimes there's a reason why you don't typically see a journal asking the quantitative people when they publish a quantitative work to say, hey, tell me which philosophical stance you stand. Because there's only barely two in terms of our philosophical stance quantitative people tend to find themselves aligned to. One is positivism, the other one is slightly post-positivism, but mostly you will find people in that positivism space. So that's why you don't need to ask them where you stand philosophically because they will be there. But if you say, if you're in the qualitative world, you don't know if they're in the interpretism or if they're in the hermeneutics or if they're in constructivity or if they're in decolonial. So there's this literally the continuum is much broader than the continuum section over here for people who are doing quantitative study. And even complicating the picture a little bit is people in the post-positivism, some of them can actually do a little bit qualitative or you can do quant. Okay. So I want my students to think this really is a continuum. The only part is not so easy to step over is positivism. Okay. So that's why you don't need to ask the research to identify where they stand philosophically. But that's why in the qualitative world, you are finding more and more, like I said, journals asking people to kind of talk about those things. At least when my students do quality work, I do want them to start there in their chapter 3 because that really helps them to see the alignment. So they are not finding the fragmentation there. Literally, there's this clear alignment or linkage why you find yourself more resonance with the qualitative approaches in general, and then you eventually land with one methodology in that big family of quality inquiry. So
this alignment that you talk about, should qualitative researchers discuss or introduce their philosophical belief in the introduction, going through literature review theoretical framework, and then justify why they choose the methods they use?
I think if you are in the field of qualitative inquiry, you're going to find it. But for journal articles, since they're not in that field, and then most of the space are given to like topic literature review and talking about findings, all that, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than, because methodology is quote unquote a tool applied rather than this is their focus on the topic, the issue, and then what that implication for the field of education leadership. So that's why you don't really see those journals give a space for that, which is very understandable because that's not a discipline. That's why I'm saying you will see more of those in very high quality dissertation, where they, in their chapter 3, they do lay it out. They start with the ontology and epistemology, then give you the justification for why they eventually land in the qualitative side, and then why they eventually landed, for example, grounded theory or, let's say, case study. That clear different level of alignment, which eventually justifying their methodological choice, is in that chapter 3. Another way I help students to understand is once you have that clarity, you also quickly can realize sometimes you also call it your theoretical framework or theoretical perspective, which is, like, for example, if somebody doing teacher leadership, in teacher leadership, there's not very concrete theory. So there tend to be a perspective or conceptual framework. So they're not concrete enough to claim a theory, which is literally talking about the elements and how they interact and then make sense of certain things. When students have a clarity, see that alignment in that philosophical to that methodology, they will quickly realize sometimes they actually had the wrong conceptual framework or theoretical framework to be actually saying, I'm going to use that to guide my so-called design. If the theory is very that positivism coming from, like, literally like you have this, you have this, you have this, and then you will have this, rather than thinking there's a contextual way, then you will find yourself, your theory is very clunky in a way when you try to use the theory to guide so-called your data analysis, mostly important.
What do you mean by clunky? Fit? It's like it doesn't fit your methods.
Yeah, so your theory could be very positivism, but then you claiming I'm going to do interpretism. And then these two are not. They can't talk to one another. So what you're finding is you are putting your theory imposed over here, try to make their work in your so-called interpretation, you become very fragmented. Or you finding the theory really is not giving you enough to explaining, because when the context is not even in the theory. That's what I mean is being clunky, is they don't go hand to hand, because the discrepancy in the philosophical stance.
In the writing, students could, for example, they choose a theory, for example, a very positivism theory, like instructional leadership, right? Because most of the articles on this topic are quantitative studies, but in their literature review or theoretical framework, they can add their own critique, right? What is missing in this theory, and then they can justify in their methods why I'm using a qualitative study, or refine or add an additional dimension of this theory. So this reminds me of the conversation we had probably a couple of years ago. You were talking about the theorizing part in the findings and the discussion section. What are your thoughts about the missing part of the theorizing, not just in qualitative study? I think in quantitative study, we have the same problem. Students or junior researchers, they simply stop at reporting their findings, but they're not bring their findings or interpret their findings in a way that can help us enrich our theoretical understandings or give us a better explanation of the phenomena you're studying.
So, I mean, I have to say this is probably not just something our students struggling. I think even after writing those years in being a researcher, I sometimes finding myself have difficult time, because I think in general, we see the theory this very philosophical, very abstract way. But also, like I said, any knowledge is kind of accumulation, right? I think for a major difference that theorizing happening, then accumulation going to take, I don't know how much, to what extent. But also, this is maybe not just critique of a field. I'm thinking more of critique of the whole academics. We are trained and rewarded being very narrow. That's called specialization. When you are so narrow, you always looking this way because that's just how you've been trained and been doing. You forgot for leadership PK12. Leadership is not only belong to higher ed. Leadership is not even for, organization. There's a lot of different leadership out there, even public administration. When you are so narrow, you are so immersed in what has been this way, you forgot there's different ways. So it's kind of you have to look beyond. It's very hard to do that when we're self-trained, other-trained, by very long time in this way. When you kind of translate that into when somebody is just doing a dissertation, they just kind of, get into this research process. that becomes challenging because when they are doing the data, they're so close to the data. So they are literally like almost like, nits of that. And then when they arrive to so-called chapter 1, we say, oh, don't stay so close. Pull yourself away and kind of look from a little distance to what that even means. And so I think that does pose challenge for our students. Like I said, I'm included for certain topics. The way I kind of help my students is, well, let's forget what is accuracy topic because you're already being immersed in data. So what are the largest message you want to tell the field? That actually helps them to kind of literally just drop what they see, those nitty bits, and thinking about the large ones, because that's really is what the implication heading for, right? Sometimes it works, sometimes not. So I'm still exploring as I say, well, just think about it, because nowadays money is always tight for schools. Think about you're going to have like almost one page to go to a donor to say, hey, those are very important. I need you to give me pretty decent size of money. And so that going to help students to starting from those large pictures, then kind of plug in what they have found out in chapter 4. And so that start kind of linking back. You have to kind of like thinking those both ways. And then they will start saying, oh, okay, those pieces, small pieces, they all coming from this big bucket. And those, what I find is coming this bucket. And then how the bucket itself is linking together. Overall, they come back to what my so-called research purpose. What I find is oftentimes, in chapter 4, they are literally just kind of like answer to a research question, okay? Because that's the most easy way to write chapter 4. Sometimes it works well if the so-called the distinction between research question 1 or 2, relatively, but sometimes it's very hard to do, especially for qualitative study, is there's no this, clear cut, there's overlapping because meaning making is not say, okay, close the door, done, meaning making here. So the meaning making is very much kind of intertwined all over. So try to kind of separate and say this is here, this is here. It's not really reality, but for the sake of simplicity and report purposes. So that's what our students typically end up to do is reporting, this is what I find from research question 1. This is what I find research question 2. But yeah, they find, some of the data actually talk both. So that's where they get to kind of like, what is the biggest message and what that really mean by the field and, by the practice, by the policymakers, and also maybe what you want to do in the future, given what you have found out about this from this study. And then that kind of helped them to kind of stay away from that too nitty-bitty thing and then kind of look at theorizing in relation to the field.
Mm-hmm. This is my experience. I feel like a good article, their discussion section is the highlight. It's not the findings section. Because the findings, you can just simply report your findings, but the discussion section is where you interpret your findings and make a connection with your theoretical framework and literature review and make recommendations. The practical recommendations for leadership practitioners and recommendations for the future research. I see discussion section is the most important part. But then I read students' discussion section. It's like redundant. It's just you're writing, you finding in a different way.
So actually, I always share that with my students, whether they're taking my courses or my own advisee. Actually, writing a qualitative study article is more difficult than writing a quantitative one, because quantitative article, you have finding and discussion separate. But because the nature of how the data in meaning making is very intertwined, you don't really see high quality qualitative article separating finding discussion. They actually shredding through. So basically the finding is connecting the literature and explained, and then what I mean connecting back to the theory is in one. So often what you see is finding and discussion. And I said, that's not easy to write. It's very much asking you to constantly linking yourself back, reposition your study back into the field, which is theorizing. So what does that mean?
That reminds me another mistake of writing qualitative research finding for a doctoral students. Sometimes probably their first trial usually they just simply present the quote. Interviewee A said this, interview B said this, and then they simply just present a blog quote. But I usually say there is no narrative. Like, you don't have a voice weaving through all different quotes. Like, what are the ideas? Those quotes are just your evidence. Like, what's the point you want to make?
Yeah. So that is another thing I help my students. I say, well, when you put quotes over there, so that only tells me you listened. That's it. That's about it. Okay. There's no data analysis. There's no theorizing. There's not even connecting back to who you are, the researcher, right? Because the researcher is the instrument in quality research. And oftentimes you will hear is we say, okay, you need to unpack. Well, that's literally what I mean is you need to unpack that quote. Raw data. It's not truly raw because the way you put a quotation, like where's all that, it's you kind of already put your interpretation. Like sometimes you put a question mark, sometimes you put an etc. That's already you kind of interpreting the unspoken emotions your participant expressed, even though they may not be the case, right? But anyway, so when I say that is, when you have a chunk of a quote, that only shows you listen, you know how to spell, okay? But nothing beyond that. If you have not unpacked what that really means, so basically you have to dissect so-called that data, and because you have a theoretical framework you just identify. So what that is that's supposed to help you do to dissect so-called that raw data, what that means, that's probably one of the most common things students just think, okay, I respect my participant. This is what they said. Okay, great. You heard them, but that's about it. Okay.
So can I use an analogy to say that the quotes are just like the words in the sentences?
No. So like I said, and the same thing when somebody is writing literature, I think the first step I help students on to get into so-called what means to be a researcher, to understand the data, is they can first treat lit review as data, which you think about it, true. The literally is data because you're not just taking the whole article, right? You are actually taking section of them, and you actually try to make sense of that. And so that's why you are like analyzing those text-based data and come up your own argument, say, this is what literature say in these big chunks. So that's what I mean is when you are giving me somebody's text, which means, okay, great, that person understood, not you. You read it and you know how to copy and paste over here. That's about it. I don't know what you're thinking. I don't know how you really understood the text. So the unpacking, that skill, that capacity building, and I try to get a student to get a little more of that kind of into their pocket in the lit review. Then that helps them to start, okay, no, I when I'm listening to my participant, just because I listened, I put into my quote, that doesn't mean the analysis is happening. So that's another way to help them to kind of, okay, unpack. When you do literature review, unpack, which means you are analyzing.
All right. So, well, any other things you'd like to add?
One of the things I do think in today's qualitative world, I think our students actually are lucky compared when I in school. The reason I say that is not saying when I was in my doctoral study, I was very fortunate because University of Georgia, their reputation, the qualitative research, that program reputation is out there because they have really good faculty scholars there, and then they're really leading. For example, if you're thinking about interviewing Catherine Roston, her name is going to be there. Okay? And she's very prolific scholar. She's very solid in terms of how you help a person to understand interview as a methodology, not just as one of the data collection method. I was fortunate to have an easy access because I was in Napa. But what I mean by nowadays students even more fortunate is because if I look at back is the person who taught me, they are all white women. If you think about knowledge, it's not this very naive thing because we know knowledge is very contextualized. And if you think about whose knowledge tend to be centered, and that's another way to say, okay, all my knowledge coming from white women, even though they are not coming from that more diverse, but they're very open. So I had opportunity to kind of venture out. So nowadays you have scholars, methodologies coming from diverse groups. So we're talking about decolonial methodology. We're talking more indigenous knowledge about how so-called research methodology look like. Nowadays you have art-based. Those are more kind of later, different addition or not very exciting things happening in qualitative methodology as a field. Nowadays students have in a very good time when you have more of those diverse. And because if you think about it, the word is not the only way we understand the world, right? There's pictures, there's artifacts, and also the way we talk, that's not the only way just because, English, but there's other. So now that's what I mean. There's more decolonial methodology out there, and you have scholars like produce really good work out there for students who are themselves coming from that background, but also research on topics needing those kind of tools to have more resources to pull from. You guys are in a much better time because you have more of the diverse tool than when I was in my doctoral studies. I still very appreciate it because the openness I learned from those scholars and methodologists allows me to see, I dabble in a few things and starting to play with those different things, but definitely far from anywhere being good. But I finding they're a very powerful tool, just like the more well-established one, for example, grounded theory, case study, narrative inquiry, because they had a much longer history in the field of qualitative research.
Before we conclude today's conversation, any practical suggestions you can offer to our doctoral students who want to do qualitative study?
Yeah, don't afraid to get into your methodology course early on. Oftentimes what you find is, especially I'm talking about students in my field, which they teach in leadership, is they tend to wait. Okay, they take quite a bit of topic, the sub-content courses. Then they kind of squeeze that little methodology course in the kind of later-ish thing. But the way I try to help my students, my advisee, is think about they literally go hand to hand. So I'm not suggesting you taking methodology course the first semester, but I would say start taking the second semester is not a bad idea at all. Because that's when you start really seeing, okay, they need to have that alignment. If you don't have a good tool, you have wrong tool, doesn't matter how great that tool is, it's going to wreck your ship, okay? That's what I mean is help to get into that, and then don't quickly say no to certain things. So keep your mind open. Don't afraid to learn things which could be very bizarre to you, right? Because sometimes we get deterred just by reading the title of that. For example, art space, like, I'm not artsy. There's no way. But guess what? You if you keep an open mind, then we're like, let me see what this thing is. And I can say, okay, because sometimes you have to be there to know that's not the thing for you, or that is the thing for you. So those are probably the two things, because, learning is is happily feeling the pain. If you're not feeling the pain, which means you're probably not learning anything new, but you have to have like little balance. So that's why I say talk to your major professor, and don't afraid even to say, okay, this is what I'm thinking, because I am sure faculty like to talk, especially with the things they've been engaged and been doing that work. So they always can quick chat with you, or you can share your ideas. They will say, have you thought about this? Because I think you can kind of build upon the faculty knowledge to give you a little shortcuts into the space, right? Because otherwise you have to go a long way. Doesn't mean that's a bad thing, but if somebody can direct you to something to get into those right space quickly, why would you not taking that? You really have excellent pool of tools available to you. And so if you remain open and understand, the tools, it will make your work much effective, but most important, really will help you to produce quality work.
Yeah. One more thing I'd like to add is read extensively. Don't just read the topic you're interested in. Always choose some articles or literature that you're remotely interested in. As you began to read, you began to build connections. Hey, I never thought about looking at this phenomenon from this perspective.
And it's nice, just to give you an example before we wrap up, is I always had a bias against personality theory, which is early on in psychology, okay? Because when I first learned it, I was like, personality? Especially with the leaders, because early on, the leadership field was trying to say, okay, let's identify who people have those traits, characters tend to be the leaders. And then now we're kind of far more removed from that way. But what I did not realize is that theory over time has changed. Okay, so it evolved so much better, but I did not, because I had to turn off by that first encounterment. So that's another good example. Say you need to remain open. Okay, just because your first encounter wasn't good. I think it was a couple years ago. And I was like, this section is all about this. I said, well, okay, I'm going to go that day. I did not have other things. So I went over there, and then the presenter was explaining that. and about the evolved version of, the personality. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is actually very, very solid way. I miss so many things. I should have just come to it earlier. I'm guilty of the chart. We're being so trained so that in that narrow way to be specialized and to be.
You may want to look into how to take a qualitative approach to study personality, because personalities traits are malleable, and put them in the organizational hierarchical environment where you have power, asymmetry, dynamics. That could be very interesting. I always tell my students, I have a doctoral student who study personality traits, and I say, you can't just study the traits. You always have to study the environment. Do we have environment for the personality to be expressed? Right?
And that reminds me, for example, in early days, the leader theory have that called situational. That's one of the phase, when a lot of theories looking at so-called, the leader versus follower, and then the situational. But it's very mechanical, okay? And then I find that to be very mechanical, and that's what I mean. Like somebody use that theory, but then they are doing a qualitative without kind of thinking, this theory needs some other things to add on in order to guide my study. And they try fully use here. So what I end up is their finding is very clunky in a sense is they are trying to impose every element here over here when their other floating things are not, when I say floating, they're not just random floating. They're really important contextual things explaining why this actually had a difficulty when somebody tried to use the theory to so-called creating a team, okay? And then create effective leading a team, it's not working. And so they have a very difficult time is because the theory itself is already not a good fit over here.
Yeah, I do see that we also need a lot of development in the theory space. Anyway, that's another topic. Maybe we should have round 2.
That's what I mean. You have tools will help you to strengthen that theorization process too. That's what we mean by they go hand to hand.
Yeah, let's say perhaps round 2 sometime in the future. Anyway, but today, thank you so much for your time. And I'll get that journal list from you and share it in the.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. Always a good chat.